All right, go for it.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's the one and only V, the Guerrilla Economist, and we are here with the man of the hour, the one and only London Paul from the SiriusReport.com. And folks, if you have not gone to the Sirius Report, that is SIRIUS, SiriusReport.com, you're missing out. Go over there, sign up for the membership, and for $4.75, for less than a price of a latte at Starbucks, you will get a daily briefing from the man himself, London Paul, every day. All day, you will get briefed on the geostrategic, the geopolitical, the geoeconomic, and the geosocial of the goings-on and musings of the world. Folks, it's valuable. I cannot tell you how, I can't emphatically tell you how valuable this service that Paul provides is, because you need to get a very clear, logical viewpoint on what's really going on. Not hype, not hyperbole, but raw reality. And that's what London Paul provides. And with that being said, London Paul, how are you, sir?
Good. Well, it's good afternoon, actually, not good morning for you. Yeah, I'm very well. How are you?
Man.
Yeah.
I'm hanging in there, bro. How's everything with you?
Yes, fine. Yeah, no problems. Just, well, apart from the sort of machinations of what's going on in the world. And without laboring the point, increasingly I'm becoming more and more, I think disturbed is the right word when it comes to US foreign policy. In whatever sphere of, be it the Ukraine, be it Syria, be it with regards to North Korea, but to a lesser extent, and then the sort of litany of nations that the US appears to be meddling in with regards to regime change. I mean, Venezuela is an obvious one, Nicaragua is another one, and it's just like we've stepped back to 30 years to the Bush era. That's what it feels like. And ultimately, it does the US absolutely no favors, because when Trump took over, Russia and China knew that his mantra was, I'm going to take a wrecking ball to. Well, he didn't use a wrecking ball, but he wanted to drain the swamp. And it's all built on trust. And the whole basis of the Trump administration was to rebuild the trust with nations such as China and Russia, and further afield. And in that regard, the trust isn't there, because they're sitting there going, well, Trump says one thing, and then his policies are doing exactly the opposite. They're doing everything to antagonize the Russians and the Chinese, and it's hugely detrimental to the US, because in the end, it needs that trust to be able to withstand the loss of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and to be able to rebuild relationships with nations that in the future it's going to have to rely on to help it. And China and Russia are two examples of that. Now, many people will argue, well, I don't agree with this, the dollar's going to survive. Somehow the debt-ridden dollar is going to survive. Well, its purchasing powers are fractions of what it was 100 years ago. It's about 80% of what it was a matter of years ago. And we can see in terms of the de-dollarization process how it's accelerated. Now, some will argue, well, this is part of this plan because Trump wants to cause the acceleration of the de-dollarization, which is going to kill the cabal in the process, or take a wrecking ball to them. And there is an argument that says fair enough in that regard. But in the process, you're damaging and destroying relationships at a rate of knots, which is, in the long term, is not going to help Trump in a post-cabal, post-dollar world. But to put it in context, when you look at the fact of how the de-dollarization process is taking effect, even in terms of SWIFT transaction, the dollar now is below 40%. It's only a matter of a few percent higher than the euro. And of course, they say, well, the yuan's only a matter of about 1.5% to 2% of those transactions. Well, it's pretty meaningless, because a lot of Chinese trade now is another trade done in the multipolar world is now barter, and barter is going to be an enormous feature of trade in the future. And we've seen how Russia and Iran have had the oil for goods barter effectively, and this is far more prevalent than people realize. Then, of course, there's the enormous SIPS uptake, which is never included in the SWIFT transactions. So you may argue, well, the dollar still has nearly 40%. But the reality is, how much SIPS uptake is there? And so what is it in a percentage of actual global trade as opposed to just SWIFT transactions? Petro yuan, we said, was a slow burner. Well, it's been actually a bit of a quicker burner than I expected, because it now has around 15% of the market in just 4 months. To put this in context, it took Brent 20 years to reach that target. So where's the Petro yuan going to be in 6 months, a year, 18 months, 2 years? No doubt bilateral trade in national currencies is now starting to accelerate at breakneck speed, as are currency swaps. And what do we see? I mean, it's been going on since 2008. It's even still pretty high. You've got enormous amounts of gold that's heading east by the UK and the US. We're actually starting to now get confirmation of things we've discussed in the past, that a lot of the loans that the Chinese are giving was actually denominated in yuan, not in dollars. Yeah, often the figure's quoted in dollars, but it's absolutely not the case that, in fact, it was actually given in dollars. You've seen the enormous expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and then you factor in how the relationship's been blossoming between the Chinese and the Russians. I mean, the Vostok 2018 military drill, a lot was made about the fact that the Chinese were there as though, oh, it's a further indication of this strengthening and blossoming ties between the two nations. No, it was an affirmation of just how strong their relations are. That's what it was telling the world, not this idea that it's still blossoming and there's all these teething problems. There isn't. You've also got to take into account Russian resources. About 60% of Russia's not even been explored. It has off-scale amounts of resources, never mind oil and gas. And what's the one thing that even the Russians are now doing, as well as the Chinese? They're opening their markets up in regions to foreign investment. And who's going to try and capitalize on that? There's no doubt Europe's going to try and capitalize on that. And I think this is where you will see Germany start to, from a trade and commerce perspective, more and more, the integration, which is the Berlin, Moscow, Beijing axis. And the other thing is China's starting to become very obvious that they've made huge advancements in technology. Not this idea that they just steal all this technology and from the US and every other nation. Absolutely not the case. And it's just another indicative step forward to the fact that the dollar is dying, and it's really dying from a lack of usage. It's not really that there's any attack on the dollar. It's just that if you're going to impose sanctions on us, you're going to impose tariffs on us, then we're going to look at alternatives and we're going to de-dollarize. And what's absolutely clear, and we said this from day one, the tariffs that Trump's imposed on the Chinese is killing the US economy. It's not having anywhere near the adverse effect on the Chinese. But I mean, just look at this whole idea. I'm not so concerned that Trump's telling the American people how strong the economy is. This is electioneering. He's got to convince them. So when we come to the midterms, hopefully he sails through, because Trump is the last chance the US has got to achieve anything meaningful in. If he doesn't win the midterms, then it's very, very bleak as to how his government and administration is going to function for the next 2 years after that. So whilst it's nonsense about the strength of the US economy, it's important that in terms of the election, that he gets through that. The only problem he's got is at some point the realization is going to hit home, and then it may be questionable whether he makes it through 2020. But let's not worry. We've got to get through 2018 and then 2019, and let's see what happens geopolitically and geoeconomically in the world. But the reality is the US economy is struggling very, very badly for all the reasons we've discussed before, and we don't need to go into. But if people believe that the US inflation rates are what it is, it's probably at 10%. US unemployment's 23, 24%. And you don't have 95 economically inactive people if your economy is that strong. And all the statistics, there's even people out there going, well, I just don't understand how we can have such low unemployment And yet some of the economic statistics don't bear this out. Well, no, because it's not reality. And I think that's really, in essence, really, we're seeing literally on a week by week, month by month basis that more and more nations are now having the strength and courage of convictions to go, well, we're not going to be bullied anymore. We're not going to be told we can't buy S-400s from the Russians. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, as much as people can be critical of Erdogan, he's absolutely right that the lira was under attack via Washington, and it's irrefutable, and it obviously revolves around the fact of Turkey's support with the Russians and the Iranians in Syria, also for the fact that they've effectively now in the process of de-dollarizing, and they wanted to buy S-400s from the Russians. And that is always the US course of action is, if you don't agree with us, don't do what we tell you, we're going to sanction you. And as I said from the outset, just everything points to the fact that the US foreign policy is as neocon as it was during the Bush era. And that's the worrying development we can argue that Trump's playing some 4D chess game. Well, I'm sorry, with respect to US foreign policy, that absolutely isn't the case. We said when Bolton took over, we were very concerned, and I think we have every justification for that, because since he came in as the national security advisor, look what's happened to US foreign policy. It's veered from one crisis to the next in terms of its attitude and how it treats other nations. I mean, as much as Syria is an obvious case in point, but I mean, we can talk a bit about what's gone in Ukraine. I mean, there's an absolute failed nation that the US was behind removing someone who was democratically elected. And now they're doing everything to antagonize and provoke Ukraine into trying almost to start a war, be it in Donbass or in the Sea of Azov, which we could probably, I guess, is something we can talk about. But I have very grave concerns about this whole foreign policy that the US is now adopting. And it certainly isn't some 4D chess game, it seems. And I talked to a number of people about this for quite a long time. And a few months ago, people were disagreeing with me. And now they're saying, yeah, we have very grave concerns that the Trump administration's foreign policy has been utterly hijacked. And the question is, can he regain control of it? And if he can't, then that's a very worrying and disturbing development in terms of, well, if the neocons have control over foreign policy, and as I tweeted something about Trump's okay until he upsets the neocons in terms of foreign policy decisions. Say he suddenly says, I'm going to pull out of Syria. And there's a classic one. He says, I'm pulling out. And we have the Duma false flag chemical weapons attack a matter of days later. It's one thing if he upsets them with foreign policy, but if he starts to do things that upset them domestically or internally, then it becomes a major problem. And then you would really see how much control does Trump have over his administration. And people may say, I'm scaremongering. Well, I'm not. This is a reality. We've seen it. I mean, just look at the facts of what's happened in US foreign policy. I mean, the JCPOA was a great example where it was sold that somehow this was to dent the cabal. We're trying to remove the cabal in Iran. This was a cabal-driven agreement. Well, if it was a cabal-driven agreement, why were the Russians and the Chinese still adamant it should be in place? Why is every nation adamant except the Israelis and the US? And also, the neocons for decades have been trying to remove the Tehran government through sanctions. That's irrefutable. Nothing's changing, yet it was suddenly sold. Oh, well, it's Trump, so it's a very different story. Frankly, Trump's attitude towards Iran and the JCPOA is hugely regrettable and is a very serious error of judgment. And the way I say it was sold is I have people saying to me, oh, it's not a problem because they're just trying to get rid of the cabal out of Iran. I said, well, which cabal? There is no cabal in Iran. Yes, there are problems in Iran internally and there is a need for reform. No one's going to dispute that. But Iran doesn't have Western cabal in its government. And I think the biggest mistake that Trump made was he was like, well, this is the JCPOA. It was an Obama administration policy. Oh, right, we're going to have to get rid of it at all costs. And it was always sold like that. It was a complete failure. it wasn't a failure. It wasn't necessarily ideal, but it did a lot to stabilize the Middle East. Fortunately, it's holding together still. It remains to be seen if it holds, indefinitely, or is there going to be some point when Iran's going to walk away from it? But I think there's sufficient economic desire, particularly the Russians and the Chinese, and also the EU, to keep it going. But there are good reasons for this. It's not some cabal reason for keeping it going. Because, as we said, Russia and China are not cabal, so why would they be trying to implement a cabal policy? And when I said that to people, it was like this blank expression. Oh, well, I hadn't quite thought of it like that. Well, these are the kind of things that people need to think about. Don't just take it on face value because the Trump administration tells you something about Syria or tells you something about Ukraine. I mean, it's like the risk of another false flag chemical weapons attack. That's not a 4D chess game. That's a serious problem that could blow up into a major hot war in the Mediterranean, the Middle East. How in any capacity is that beneficial to removing the cabal and draining the swamp? It absolutely isn't. It just furthers their ambition and aim to cause and wreak havoc in the Middle East, which is precisely why they're responsible for the invasion of Syria in the first place and the attempt to overthrow Assad.
We see the U.S., Paul, and we see this in Syria. This morning, CJ and I was talking about it. Here we are, the United States Marines are actually training, hundreds of Marines training side by side with, quote unquote, the rebels. And I love how they use these nice words, rebels. For what? Al-Qaeda. I like how they're using kinetic action instead of war. And so this is what's happening on the anniversary of 9/11. Here is the United States Marine Corps training with Al Qaeda in as a show of force against the Russians. And again, the U.S. is not working as a willing participant to de-escalate the situation, but they're working to escalate the situation. And we see this in the Ukraine as well. $1 billion spent arming the Ukrainians to create what? More havoc, more provocations. Anywhere in the world, apart from North Korea, and the verdict is still out on that one, where the heck are we working to de-escalate? Where are we working as a partner for peace without any sort of ulterior motive? I don't see it, Paul.
No, absolutely not. And I made a tweet and I said the following. I said, it's truly staggering that Washington expects the world to believe that Assad, who is on the verge of ending the war in Syria, decides to gas his own people who are largely highly supportive of him, whilst US coalition partners are threatening to bomb his country. And, and for me, it's as simple as that. And I'm absolutely staggered that anybody believes it's anything to the contrary. But sadly, there's too many people, and it's not just in the US, but also in the UK, who buy this utter nonsense. And you make the Ukraine's a very good point, because there's something, CJ, we had a bit of a chat, as things would you like to discuss? And he raised a very good point, which is that the Ukraine's got this military presence in the Azov Sea. Now, its National Security and Defense Council agreed to take these steps to what they term boost the country's combat capabilities in the area. And of course, traditionally since 2003, Russia and Ukraine have enjoyed this freedom of use of this Sea of Azov. And because they regard them as internal waters of both Ukraine and Russia, but now Ukraine doesn't want to recognize Russia's rights. And the Ukraine authorities have insisted on the right to detain any ships traveling to or from Crimea without Kiev's permission. And they've called for the imposition of international sanctions against Russian Black Sea ports, calling it the blockade of the Sea of Azov. Now, it's already caused some serious incidents back in the spring where they detained ships and searched them. They interrogated crew members that were supposed to have beaten them up. They violated international agreements. And only recently, a tanker was detained in the Ukrainian port of Kherson. And what have we seen with regards to this? We haven't seen the US saying, hang on a minute, Ukraine, what the hell are you doing? No. It's taken a deliberately provocative stance, the State Department, actually urging Ukraine to be confrontational. It's effectively goading Ukraine into taking military action, including the use of warships, of NATO's standing forces to protect its shipping lanes, even talking mining the Azov Sea or using fast-moving attack vessels to encircle Russian Navy assets. The American Foreign Policy Council believes that the US administration should send anti-ship missiles as well as a viable launch platform and targeting system. And the Atlantic Council are a think tank that advises the State Department and enjoys influence over them about shaping US foreign policy, published these findings. The Institute of World Policy called for fast-track shipments to Ukraine of anti-shipment missiles, enabling it to attack Russian vessels. And the idea of providing Ukraine with Coast Guard ships also is under consideration by the US government. And Kurt Volker, who's the US Special Representative for Ukrainian negotiations, well, negotiating what, I'd like to know, stated that the US administration is ready to expand arms supplies to Ukraine in order to build up the country's naval and air defense forces. Now, how exactly is that de-escalating tensions? How exactly is that playing into this idea that, you know, the Russians and Trump, or Putin and Trump, are playing some game to circumvent the cabal? No, this is antagonistic. It's deeply angered the Russians. It's also creating potentially a risk of a hot war developing in that region. I mean, we can't rule it out. I'm not saying it will happen. And what have we seen that the US is, Poroshenko has done? He's wrecked the economy. It's financially collapsed. The corruption is on a level that beggars belief. And, you know, the only option the US administration is considering is providing Ukraine with arms to fight Russia in Donbass and in the Sea of Azov, and encouraging Kiev to escalate the tensions. Now, if that's not classic neocon tactics, I don't know what is. And that is why I'm deeply disturbed by developments where I've not seen Kurt Volker do anything to de-escalate tensions. At no point has he sat down with Ukraine and said, look, I'm terribly sorry, but you have failed to abide by the Minsk Accords. Every other nation has. Everyone is trying to de-escalate tensions and reduce the problem. You've done nothing. No, they're just antagonizing the situation and effectively using Ukraine as a pawn because it borders Russia. And I'm sorry to say, but from Trump's perspective, it should be pretty obvious what's going on. But either, for whatever reason, he's incapable of doing anything about it. And I think the truth is, if he stood up and said, I'm sorry, we're not tolerating this, we're not helping Ukraine anymore, we're going to stop aid to Ukraine, we're not providing any more missiles, and by the way, we're going to de-escalate the matters with Russia with regards to Ukraine, and by the way, Kiev, make sure you abide by the Minsk Accords. I think the reaction will be pretty hostile internally, and I think that's the problem he's up against. How much control does he actually have over foreign policy, and by extension, maybe even internal policy? It's hard to say. But at the moment, I'm not seeing any evidence from a foreign policy perspective.
I think the foreign policy perspective, Paul, has been abysmal. It's been pretty bad. It's 50-50, number one. Not even 50-50. Maybe a 10% chance. And then look internally. Who showed up for work today at the Justice Department? Who had coffee at the taxpayer's expense? Who had donuts at the taxpayer's expense? Who had lunch at the Bruce Orr is still there. Well, Jeff Sessions won't fire him, and then the all the QAnon pundits are out there saying it's 4D chess. V, you don't understand. It's 4D chess. And meanwhile, Paul, you and I have been calling this out. This is not 4D chess or 3D chess. This is one-dimensional Connect Four. It's pretty straightforward.
Well, yeah, and the problem is, I've said all along, I'll judge Sessions by what he does, not what I think he should do, or by what I hope he does. He has to be judged by what he does, and he's running out of time rapidly to do the things you'd expect the Attorney General to do. And I mean, and the obvious thing is, well, okay, so he's recused himself from the whole Russiagate thing. Well, if he hadn't done that, and he never stood as Attorney General. We'd never have spoken about Mueller investigation, which has hamstrung the Trump administration, not just domestically, but in terms of foreign policy, and particularly with regards to Russia in the process, such now that we have this foaming at the mouth attitude that, if someone blinks wrong in the world, it's the Russians. I mean, and it's absolutely farcical. And sadly, there's too many Trump supporters who are buying this. I mean, yeah, the Democrats will jump on the bandwagon and love this because it deflects the scrutiny away from where the whole Russiagate investigation should be, which revolves around the DNC, revolves around dubious activities going on to do with uranium one, and the list goes on and on and on, which we've discussed many times before. But yeah, absolutely right. Until Sessions delivers, and he's running out of time, if he doesn't deliver, I'm sorry, he's an abysmal failure as an Attorney General, and he's not doing the job he should be doing. And at the end of the day, at some point, he's going to have to go, well, actually, we're going to have to reopen the investigation into the Clinton email. So we're going to have to open investigations into countless people. And at the moment, as you say, what's changed? And I made a comment the other day on Twitter saying, it's all well and good removing low-hanging fruit, but it doesn't deal with the fundamental problem of the institutions that run the Beltway, run Washington. If you don't tackle the fundamental root cause of the problem, removing individuals does nothing, because you can take people out the FBI, you can take people out the Department of Justice, you can take people out the US Treasury or anywhere else you want, but it doesn't fundamentally change the fact that the policies that these institutions implement just carry on in perpetuity. So I'm not interested in seeing low-hanging fruit removed as though it's some great big political game or big political sort of chess piece move, and it's a huge victory for freedom. I don't see it at all. I see it as a meaningless step that doesn't achieve anything until we see the very heart of the corruption that exists in Western governments. Let's not just pick on Washington. We can talk about London, Paris, Berlin, and everywhere else for that matter. Till you actually see a dagger to the heart, and I use the seven-headed Hydra approach. You have to cut it off at the stem of the neck. You can't just chop an ear off one of the heads and think you've achieved anything, because nothing changes. And thus far, for all the promise, we haven't seen anything delivered. And I'm not interested in timescales. People can tell me it's this month, next month, last month, or 6 months ago. It's irrelevant. Until it actually happens, as far as I'm concerned, I'll believe it when I see it. And I'm optimistic in the end we will see things. But at the moment, it's not happening. And I think too many people have become very blasé, believing that there's this great big plan that's unfolding and don't worry about it, everything's okay. Well, I'm seeing no evidence of it. I'm also very concerned when I see pictures where, was it Melania Trump's wearing a dress and someone's photoshopped the Q letter on it, and everyone's, oh, look, Melania Trump's wearing a dress with Q on. Well, actually, it wasn't. It was Photoshop. It never had the letter Q on it. And when you see these kind of things, it's hugely damaging to people's understanding of the reality of what's unfolding. And in fact, if anything, whatever your belief about the Q is, it's damaging to that as well, because people are going to go, hang on, there's people, suggesting that, this is reality when in fact it wasn't. So I have concerns about that. But at the end of the day, the proof of the pudding's in delivering. And we have to start to see real evidence that changes are happening, that the swamp's being drained. And I particularly will focus on Sessions because I think he has a huge responsibility. And it's about time he pulled his finger out and made these changes, because I suspect if he doesn't, then after the midterm, I wouldn't be surprised if Trump removes him from office, because he is totally ineffectual. Now is not the time to do it. You don't want to start seeing heads roll at this point in time. But at some point, if he doesn't start to deliver, then he's going to have to go. And there's been some pretty harsh criticism from Trump on Twitter with regards to Sessions, which seems to have been largely forgotten. And then it's the idea, oh, well, this is just a pretend war of words that, everything's fine. Well, at what point do we start to go, hang on, there's all these events happening. This is the reality of it. But let's ignore it and pretend it's some 4D chess game. Well, I'm sorry, you have to see what's actually been undertaken, what's actually coming about as a result of it, rather than trying to infer there's some angle to it that none of us are seeing. I mean, I had people telling me it was a 4D chess game. When the US missiles hit Duma, okay, most of them failed for a false flag chemical weapons attack. But my question to them was, how does this benefit draining the swamp? How is this helping to remove the cabal? It doesn't in any way, shape, or form. And there's another great example, the white helmets. The US stopped funding them, and then suddenly Trump gives them $6.6 million more funding. Who's removing the white helmets out of southern Syria? The US were involved, and the Israelis. Then we see that the white helmets have turned up in northern Syria, in the vicinity of Idlib, where there's all the risk of this false flag chemical weapons attack. Now, they had long enough to look at this and say, hang on, what are the white helmets actually doing? Should we continue funding it? And I'll give some credit to the Netherlands government, who've actually now said we're not funding them anymore. They've stopped funding them. And you know, kudos to them for doing so. But I was pleased when the Trump administration sat back and said, hang on, we're not funding them. And then all of a sudden, they're writing them a check for $6.5 or $6.6 million. And I'm supposed to buy that this is some kind of game or some kind of 4D chess move. No, they're funding an organization who has very questionable presence inside Syria from multiple sources that is backed up by solid, hard evidence. You can't dress this up. And I think people need to stop dressing this up and trying to believe that it's something it isn't. It's another disturbing development in keeping with far too many disturbing developments in the Trump administration.
And you're seeing some of these inconsistencies slithering yawn up and down all over. Paul, the situation here also is one of the things I want to touch base with you on is the ever broadening and dangerous situation in Syria. The situation that at any day can spiral. Why don't you paint for us how dangerous this situation is? Because I think people are going to think that this time again there's going to be some cruise missiles that are going to be fired off, and the Russians are going to sit idly by and do nothing.
Well, let's take it one step at a time. I mean, this is another example of a worrying development with the Trump administration, because we always said, look, at some point you can guarantee there's going to be another attempt at a false flag chemical weapons attack. We said that after Duma. It took until we got to Idlib, which is really the last stronghold for Daesh, Al-Qaeda, whatever you want to call it. Now, the thing that concerned me most is that the Russians went to the Americans and said, look, we have clear, unequivocal evidence that this is a staged chemical weapons attack. It's designed to frame the Assad government. It's got nothing to do with Assad. And the US simply weren't interested in looking at this. Now, if I was Trump, I'd be saying, hang on a minute. I'm supposed to have this strong relationship with Putin. And this is what everyone keeps being, oh, no, there's this great strong relationship with Putin and Trump. Well, clearly that relationship isn't that strong, because effectively via Putin, the Russians presented this or tried to present this evidence, and that Washington dismissed it and said it was nonsense, and then started up in the ante, not only saying, well, if this chemical weapons attack happens, we're going to launch a strike on Assad's target. They went as far as almost saying at one point, well, we'll just take a preemptive strike because we believe he's going to launch this chemical weapons attack. Oh, and by the way, we might just target the Russians and the Iranians in the process. I mean, this is the kind of madness talk that it's taking it up to a whole new level. It was bad enough in Duma. It was bad enough the year before when they struck the airbase, which the names slipped my mind for a second. But anyway, the point is that they took it to another level. Now, yeah, the reality is if this was to happen, then the Russians last time warned the US that they're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior anymore. Now, the risk is if the US then decides to launch missile attacks on Assad, if they happen to strike Russian and Iranian targets or try to in the process, okay, it doesn't matter whether the fact that the Russians can shoot the majority out the sky. The risk is the Russians have a huge naval presence in the Mediterranean. So do the Chinese. I've said this before, but China does. It's not well known, but China has a presence there. And they're facing off against the US and NATO partners. Now, are we going to see a hot war in the Middle East? Sorry, in the Mediterranean? Because if we do, the US fleet will be sunk out into oblivion. And the worst part could be is it could actually happen where, and this people will say this is I'm sorry, it's nonsense what you're saying, but it isn't nonsense because Russian military technology is far in advance. The Russians could in effectively you could see the entire US Navy sunk without Russia striking a single missile at them. And if you don't believe that, look at the US Donald Cup where they froze all the electronic. The Russians have technology so far ahead of the US, it's 75 years ahead. Now, to put that in context, military progression in terms of technology is not linear. So even if we took it back linearly, we're talking World War II. But in reality, the Russian technology now is like the US having World War One technology compared to the Russian, and maybe even further back than that. That's how the chasm of difference. And people will say, I'm sorry, that's absolute nonsense, and I don't agree with you. Well, it doesn't matter. Don't agree with me, but that's the reality. So, yes, it's absolutely crassly foolish and stupid for the US to even consider this as an option. And again, I think it's the US doesn't believe that the Russians will respond that way. They think, oh, in the end, they'll just back off and we can do precisely what we want. But again, this is another classic neocon tactic. And it's escalating things in Syria to a totally different level. I mean, I'm wholly critical of the Obama administration, who actually, of course, were responsible for why this whole Syrian civil war, as they call it, but it isn't. The war in Syria started in 2011. But the point is, when the US had an opportunity in 2013 to launch missile attacks, the Obama administration backed off and didn't do so. Well, we've seen twice the Trump administration do it. And are they seriously going to do it a third time on the basis of what? Anyone knows full well it's a false flag chemical weapons attack for precisely the reason I said. Assad has zero reason to do so. He has the support of his people. He's on the verge of winning the war. And let's be honest, if you were sat there going, well, I'm achieving all these objectives, I know, I'll just do something reckless to kill my own people and give the US the authority to come and bomb my country in any which way, how they like, is absolute insanity. So therefore, everyone knows, except seemingly people in the West don't seem to understand this because they believe the nonsensical propaganda that's come out. But certainly, yeah, Syria is a major problem. It's a major threat, and no one should underestimate the severity of the outcome. Now, okay, it's the 17th of September, and thus far, nothing's materialized, but you can't rule out the fact that the neocons are that desperate, and they're just war hungry. And that's it. They're just desperate for a war. Anywhere in the world they can start a war. They'd love to start a war. And so unless everyone acquiesces and does exactly what they want, when they want, how they want. And, you know, look back to the Bush administration and the Bush era, particularly sort of even Daddy Bush era. And you saw the way people then seem to have forgotten what's the difference in the foreign policy doctrine then. And even during, obviously, we all know what happened as a result of 9/11 and this so-called bogus war on terror and all the things that happened. I mean, tell me what's different. There is absolutely nothing different. The only difference this time is the Russians' military technology is light years ahead. China's economically a lot stronger, and the world collectively is now turning its back on the US, namely the US dollar. And the utter distrust across the world is meaning that the neocons' position is infinitely weaker in one sense, but it doesn't make, it's like any caged animal. There's a risk it'll lash out, and we should never underestimate the severity of it. And you know, people need to start questioning, why is the Trump administration prepared to risk this? And ultimately, Trump has to take responsibility and say, hang on, why are we doing this? Because I don't believe that everybody inside the Pentagon and everyone inside his administration is all gung-ho and wanting a war, because we know full well Mattis said prior to the Duma missile attack, he told Trump, don't launch any missile attacks. Don't do this. It's reckless and you shouldn't even consider it. And he plowed ahead and did it. So he ignores Mattis. And a lot of people will criticize Mattis and level a lot of, he's been called Mad Dog and everything else under the sun. But actually, he seems to be a very level headed individual with regards to US foreign policy and is trying to temper the risk that such an attack could cause. And I don't doubt that similar conversations probably happened between Mattis and Trump again with regards to this, the threat, and saying, well, hang on, we've had this before twice. And actually, it was the Charette Air Base while it came back into my head in, was it 2017? But the point is, I mean, you can say to Trump, well, okay, it's forgivable for it to happen twice, but to happen, the risk, I mean, if it happens 3 times, I'm sorry, it's totally unforgivable because you can't fall for the same nonsense 3 times when it's absolutely obvious to anyone who thinks for 30 seconds that Assad has zero reason, and the people who have all the reason to want to invoke a false flag chemical weapons attack is precisely Daesh. Oh, and the rebels and whatever else you want to call them, because they're the ones who are put in there by the cabal to overthrow Assad, have regime change, and put their puppet Syrian government in. They're the ones who are desperate to keep this war going, the neocon, and Al Qaeda are just there, or Daesh are their proxies to do exactly that. So yeah, that's why it's that serious.
Paul, let's talk about, switching gears real quick, the new Russian energy rival to Gazprom. Because while we're out there just ruining and making muck of things, the rest of the world, the rest of the productive world, it seems, is going forward, coming out with innovations, and moving beyond this childishness. Go for it.
Yeah, well, everyone, I mean, you've obviously got Rosneft, but then you've got Gazprom, who's the biggest natural gas producer in the world. And I remember, yeah, it's glad you sort of raised this point because I was looking at this a while ago and I was quite surprised that, in essence, there's a company called Novatech who really are involved in liquid natural gas LNG. And what's interesting is that in 2008, the difference between their market caps was over 340 billion. Now they're both valued around 50 billion, which shows Novatech's market capitalization's gone through the roof relatively, and Gazprom's is collapsed. Now, people will argue, well, how's that possible? Because Gazprom's got vast natural gas reserves, and they are absolutely enormous, and it's multiple times bigger than Novatech's. But of course, it's a state-run company, and therefore it has to divest some of its profits. And also, you have to bear in mind that it's responsible for building enormous infrastructure, which is hugely costly. And it's done an enormous amount of infrastructure building. So it's not surprising that Gazprom's market capitalization's decreased. But what's Novatech done? It's very cleverly found a niche in the liquefied natural gas business. It's controlled by some very powerful Russians, but it's co-owned actually by France's Total, which is interesting. And no doubt Gazprom has burdened by being state-owned. It spends a huge amount, not just on domestic, but international gas pipelines. But what's Novatech done? It's actually very cleverly. It started its first LNG plant last year, and it was on time and in budget. And it's actually, developing the country's Arctic gas reserves, and it's got very strong ties with the French Total and also China. Unsurprisingly, the company's directors were sanctioned by the US in the process. No surprise there. But the incredible thing is comes back to this thing where Trump thinks that the US is going to steamroller Europe and take over the LNG market. Well, what he fails to realize is why is European nations going to spend 30, 40, 50% more on LNG import than they can get from the Russians. And Novatech's a great example of a company that I think effectively they could have made it part of Gazprom, didn't, and said, okay, we can spin this off. It'd be far more profitable. LNG is a lot less expensive in terms of infrastructure development. And it's been highly profitable, a very successful business. And yeah, it's another example of a Russian company that's come from relative obscurity in a very short space of time and is now a very dominant player in the Russian energy sector, along with Rosneft and, of course, Gazprom in the process. But yeah, it's no surprise, but it's another example of why this folly that the US can compete with the Russians in terms of energy. I mean, it's absolutely incredible that you've heard the US making reference to the fact of how dare the Russians weaponize energy or use energy as some form of economic weapon against nations, which they haven't done. Whereas, forgive me if I'm incorrect about this, but what the hell have the US been doing with the dollar for decades? Something they've completely forgotten, as though, in fact, no, we haven't done anything of the sort. We've used the dollar to benefit the world, and look at all the success story of what the dollar's done for nations across the world. But it's that staggering level of arrogance and ignorance that it never ceases to amaze me, but in one sense. But it's ultimately the very undoing of the US in the process, because they have this level of arrogance that somehow do as we say, not as we do.
And it is arrogance. It's arrogance that's only derived when you've been the petrodollar for X amount of decades, when you've been the world reserve currency for X amount of decades, when you've been the sole superpower for X amount of decades. Hubris is something that often goes and poisons the mind of a nation, and that's where we are today, Paul, where we're overestimating our capabilities and underestimating our challenges.
Yeah, and Iran's a great example of that, because everybody's pointing out to the US, look, you maybe have disagreements with Tehran. You may be unhappy about their presence in Syria, although it's pretty benign, and really being rattled by the Israelis into believing this. And there's no doubt that that's exactly what's kind of fomented Trump's view of the Iranians, and hence why he walked away from the JCPOA. But of course, coming up in November, early November the 4th, sanctions are due to be reimposed on Iran's oil industry. It's the second round of sanctions. Now, there's all this belief it's going to severely impact Iran's oil industry and exports, and there's going to be this massive decline in production. And the US isn't taken into consideration that the nations are already finding ways to get around the problem, and they will carry on being supplied by Iran for their imports. And China has already increased their oil imports by 600,000 barrels of oil per day. But what's the US trying to do? It wants nations like Saudi Arabia and Russia to increase oil production. So on the one hand, it's telling the Russians who it's sanctioning to oblivion. I mean, I don't think there's anything left in Russia to sanction by the Americans. But they're doing this, and then in the next breath saying, oh, but please take up the slack created by Iranian sanctions. So, the oil price doesn't go up too high, which is going to be damaging to our economy. So Russia, we're going to screw you over sanctions. We're going to threaten to bomb you in Syria and the Iranians. We don't listen to anything you say regarding Iran or the JCPOA, but please help us with regards to the oil price. And the US Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, met in Moscow with his Russian counterpart. And they all said, I thought, hope, well, maybe there's some hope. Maybe there's some common sense will prevail as a result of this meeting. And they said, they discussed ways in which the US and Russia could, work together to ensure world energy market stability, transparency, sustainability. It was all hot air because, in essence, what does the US says? Well, we're insisting on sanctions on Iranian oil. Oh, by the way, we're continuing to object to the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. And we are still thinking about imposing sanctions on any nation who is part of that project or a recipient of gas or anything else for that matter. And, and they expect the Russians to sit there and go, okay, well, this is great that we're talking about market stability and sustainability and transparency. Meanwhile, you're dictating to us, telling us precisely what we should do and shouldn't do. And then Perry states, well, the US, we're quite, happy to have competition with Russia in energy markets across Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. They're so happy with the competition, they're threatening to sanction Nord Stream 2. That's how much they regard it as competition. And then they say Moscow can no longer use energy as an economic weapon. Well, it never has. The problem the US won't understand or face is that Russian gas production and LNG is considerably cheaper. I mean, it's a bit like you and I going to the local shopping mall and going in one store and someone saying, well, that costs $30. And you go to the next one and they say it's 15, and you go, I'm terribly sorry, you can't buy it for a cheaper price. If you buy it for 15, we're going to sanction you. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. And they think that the US is now in this position to offer all these alternative sources of supply without actually realizing there's no economic benefit to nations to do so. This is a huge problem. And again, it's just a simple lack of understanding. You can't bully nations on the one hand and then demand that they cooperate with you in the next, because frankly, why would Russia want to bother to cooperate with the US? And this again disproves this idea that there's this strong relationship between the Trump administration and Putin. There might be a fledgling relationship between Trump himself and Putin, where Trump and Putin understands what Trump's mandate was when he was elected. But then he's going to look at situations like this and go, well, you're the commander in chief, you're the president. You're ultimately not telling Perry when he comes to these negotiations, say, excuse me, you're not going to threaten sanctions over Nord Stream 2. We're not going to sanction Iranian oil and try and cripple the market for Iran. And in the next breath, expect all these other nations to prop the market up just so it benefits the US in the process. And this is the problem that Moscow has and Beijing has. And I'm sorry, but you have to deal with what's put before you. And the trade war, effectively what it is now, is another case in point. China had no intention of doing so, but there comes a point where, the US aren't making any headway. China's effectively now got to the point where they're saying these talks with regards to reaching, an end to the impasse between, the the Chinese and the US with regards to trade. They know that it's never going to work, so there's no point trying. And the US's attitude is, well, you haven't agreed to this, so we're just going to put more and more sanctions on you. I mean, in the end, the US itself is going to run out of things it can sanction in China, rather like it's basically ran out of anything it left to sanction the Russians over. And that's the other thing, the whole Skripal debacle. The US used it as immediately went, oh, I know, we're just going to put more sanctions on you. And actually, by the way, we want unfettered access to check that you haven't got any chemical weapons, even though the OPCW confirmed that Russia has no chemical weapons, whilst the US forgets to tell the world, actually, we never signed up to the convention and we still have them ourselves. And I'm not saying there's any tie-up between what happened with the Skripals and what happened with regards to chemical weapons or whatever was used. But the point is, again, you just cannot speak to nations like this and expect them to listen and take you seriously. And as I said, prior to even Trump being elected, but it's actually getting worse, is the US turn up in summit, they speak at the UN or anywhere else, everyone listens to what they said, kind of nods their head, and when they walk out the room, they'll go, okay, so what are we actually going to do now? Because no one's listening to the US anymore. No one's interested in taking any note of them, because from their perspective, they're not seeing any evidence that the US wants to meet anyone halfway, that they want to stabilize and normalize relations with other countries and bring an end conflicts across the world. I mean, Yemen's another example. Everyone knows the humanitarian crisis that's being caused in Yemen by the Saudis, yet the US is complicit in helping to refuel Saudi aircraft. They've got special forces inside Yemen working with the Saudis. Again, it's another harebrained foreign policy decision. And unfortunately, it's stacking up and up. And every time, there was a spell where we thought, yeah, Trump was keen to bring an end to the nonsense in Ukraine. He was keen to get out of Syria. I don't doubt on a level Trump wants to do all this, but he's incapable of doing that. And the fact he's incapable means as a president, he's lost control of his foreign policy. And we had a spell where it was obvious he'd lost control of his presidency. He regained it. But again, it seems like he's lost control of his presidency. And there's nothing that convinces me to the contrary, because I'm not seeing any evidence that says we're having a major change in US foreign policy. We're actually, Sessions is doing something internally within the US. We're actually starting to see people who should no longer be employed in whatever department they're in still working there. And also the idea, there's people who have security clearance that frankly shouldn't have security clearance anymore. That should be stopped. Why aren't these things happening? Why aren't they reopening investigations into the Clinton email server? And why is Sessions simply not doing anything as an attorney general he should do? And until I see anything to the contrary, then I don't see a Trump administration that's capable at the moment, or seemingly capable. I'm not saying there isn't a desire, but they don't seem capable of doing the thing that he was mandated to do when he was elected. And that raises a whole bunch of very serious questions as to why that's the case. So we'll have to see what happens. But I would say if he manages to be successful in the midterms, gets through that, if we don't see something happening sort of December, January time, or the remainder of November with any major significant changes, then we have to start to seriously question who is actually running the Trump administration, because by that point, and there can't be any more excuses given for anybody not to actually deal with the major problems that are thwarting the ability of whoever to drain the swamp, remove the cabal, deep state, whatever you want to call it. And no more excuses can be made anymore. You can give latitude for so long, but how long's Trump been in office? It's getting, 2 years in November. Well, effectively, okay, he was inaugurated in the January. Let's give him some latitude, but you're talking 20 months. And we're not seeing enough changes or anything actually happening. And how long do you keep giving someone the benefit of the doubt before you start to say, I mean, what's it going to happen? 12 months from now, we're still going to be going, oh, don't worry, there's a plan and it's all going to turn out fine. I mean, by the way, then the world's moved on. The world is moving on. And increasingly, we're seeing the integration of Germany into the Eurasian axis. And nations in Europe are starting to move more and more. And to a lot, even the UK, for goodness sake. I mean, okay, they're never going to formulate any relations with Russia. I mean, in fact, they're foaming at the mouth more about the Russians than the US at the moment over the whole Skripal thing. But they are even trying to start to formulate stronger relations with China. But what are we seeing? We're not seeing the US developing any relations with any nation at all in any meaningful way. They're not signing trade deals. They're not signing cooperation agreements with anybody. And what are Russia and China and countless other nations doing? They're signing all these agreements, and yet we're supposed to believe China's this big bad ogre who's trying to take over the world with US hegemony Mark II, and the rest, 70% of the world are looking at people making these comments going, sorry, are you serious? Because that's not our experience. China and Russia aren't pointing a gun to anyone's head and telling them to do as they're told. Nations are working with them, and if agreements don't work out, they want to negotiate them. That's exactly what's happening. China's very cooperative, and Russia, for that matter, in the process. And what are we seeing is all the nations where the US is attempting regime change and to cause economic implosion. I mean, Venezuela is an example. Maduro's has caused a lot of problems. There's no doubt about it. But why do you think the Chinese just gave the Venezuelans a $5 billion equivalent lifeline? Because they're trying to stabilize a country they know that's under threat from US neocons. And we've said all along China will backstop nations and prevent their collapse. The Russians are doing the same. They've helped with Venezuelan oil. I'm not defending Maduro by any stretch of the imagination, but the problems in Venezuela have been exacerbated multifold because of deliberate US intervention to collapse the economy and remove Maduro.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Paul, we're at the end of the show. Your last bit of comments, as well as giving out your social media and website once again. Go for it, Paul.
I think that the only comment I would make is I think from here on in, we have to have brutal honesty. That is the only way forward. We have to just be straight and honest about what's going on. No, I mean, I'm not a US citizen, obviously, but I want the US to be a successful, vibrant nation and a great nation amongst equals. That would be fantastic for the world. It'd be fantastic for the US and the US people. So that, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend it's happening when it's not. So people might not like what's said, but it's reality. And at the moment, I'm not seeing anything that says to the contrary. I'll be very pleased if Sessions, for example, starts to do the things we expect him to do. We start to see the Trump administration take a different attitude towards foreign policy. Then I'll be extremely pleased with the developments we're seeing. But at the moment, we're not. So we have to just be brutally honest and say, this is reality. And we've always been very fair to Trump. We've praised him and given him where it's due, but equally we're going to be very critical. And I'm sorry to say, but I think I'm as critical as I have been of the Trump administration since he was elected, and he's not delivering at the moment on what he should be delivering. Let's hope it changes because it has to change. And I agree there's a certain element of electioneering going on, and he needs to ensure he wins the midterm. And I will say, and as much as I'm critical, Trump is really the US's last hope of salvaging the wreckage that is being caused by the cabal and by the neocons and all the hordes of actors in the process. So that has to happen. And we may find that if he steamrollers the midterms, we might see a change in policy afterwards. But I would say, from my perspective, the next 4 months or so are pivotal and critical to the Trump administration and its future. We may be sat and talking in 3 or 4 months going, wow, look at all the developments. This is fantastic. We're seeing real clear evidence of major changes that are going to be beneficial to the US domestically and internationally. But if we get to that end within 3 or 4 months and we're still stymied by a Mueller investigation, by a lack of progress internally to drain the swamp or deal with the deep state cabal and a change of US foreign policy, then we have to start to question, is it actually going to happen? And if it isn't, how's the world going to respond and react to that? Because the one thing is, if the neocons hijack the US, Russia and China aren't going to stand there and say, well, actually, okay, we'll just cut you some latitude, Trump. They're going to say, I'm terribly sorry. We're not cutting you any more latitude. We're not going to try and help you and resolve problems. And because why should they? And Trump had no reason to go after trade tariffs with China. It was foolish. It's backfiring, and the damage it's causing Trump in terms of businesses in the US who are bitterly opposed to tariffs. And it's not making much of the mainstream news in the US, but from people I've spoken to, there's trade and commerce sectors and industries and bodies who are absolutely furious because it's damaging their businesses. And the US doesn't need its thriving economy, albeit as small as it is, to be damaged and effectively flattened by a Trump policy, which I feel is just trying to score some points and say to China, you're going to do what we want you to do. And of course, China was never going to do that, as we said, and that is very, very disappointing. But let's see what happens. But until I see a change of policy by then, I'm going to remain very skeptical and very concerned. And I think no one can criticize that viewpoint. I mean, there's no good living on hope and belief in something is going to happen until it happens. And the more people believe in something and it doesn't happen, in the end, they get more and more deflated in the process. It's better to be brutal and honest. And, and it's another thing, people shouldn't rest on their laurels. They need to make sure Trump wins the midterm, because if they don't, then I'm sorry, the problems are just going to get even greater. And it's going to become virtually impossible for Trump to govern in the process, which ultimately is what the US needs. And because if they don't, I mean, what's going to happen if the Democrats get control? What do we think is going to happen for the next 2 years? They'll just do everything to stymie and frustrate the Trump administration, or make the Mueller investigation look like a cakewalk. And we know the damage that's done to the Trump administration in the process. So sorry to sound so brutal, but and honest, but that's the only way we can be about things. And
I agree wholeheartedly, man. We are facing a very grim reality if people don't wake up and take this country back. And that's just the bottom line. London Paul, thank you, sir, for being on. We look forward again next week for you to be on. And with that being said, folks, again, subscribe to the channel, comment, like, and share, and check out thesiriusreport.com. Sign up to Paul's membership site and make it happen for yourself. Enjoy it and relish it, because it's a lot of things happening. You need to keep abreast. SiriusReport.com. Take it away, CJ.